Hey, good morning, church. Hope you're well on this very warm Sunday. I'm really excited to be sharing week 2 of Global Church within the broader series of Future Church. And I feel like I've talked a lot lately. Been talking to you around our heart for the church of the future and what God is doing around the world. And so this is the last time I'll share for a few weeks, and I'm really excited about this. But next week, we're going to hear from our compassion representative, which is something that the church has supported for quite a period of time. Then after that, on the 13th, we have Christmas parties in groups. And then on the 20th, we are going to have a all-in gathering at church again to celebrate Christmas together. And so we've got a number of exciting weeks to come. But today, we're going to wrap up this series so that, like we said last week, you guys are really clear on what is in the heart of Garth and Jamie and what we are a part of as a church. And so last week we looked at some of the big picture of what God is building around the world in the global church, which from a lot of your feedback is something that you're really excited about. And a couple of thoughts just on that again to refresh our memory. Is this, that the reason that we're talking about this is not that we need to be worried too much around what happens down the track and what the future holds. It's to understand what is in our heart so that you know who your pastors are. We need to balance understanding this big picture of what God is calling us to with the fact that we don't know a lot of the details about what this looks like. So that's just something to be mindful of. Also, that remember that this fourth wave of missions that we're entering into, these are pioneering days. And so a lot of what this is going to be around over the coming years is trying to discern and discover some of the best practices around how we can be a part of outworking this around the world. And so we need to be patient together. We need to commit to one another as we try and walk into the unfolding of this grand plan of God and what it looks like for C3 people to be part of that. And so we've downloaded the big picture of what God's doing around the world through the history of missions and the season in which he has the church in right now. And today I want to share a bit more detail around where we feel, Jamie and I and the team, we feel God leading us into as a church, and it will give some understanding around the whole Nairobi factor and some other things that are on our heart. And so I pray that we would have ears to hear today, that we would download something from heaven together, and that we would be able to walk into a space of oneness where we can really just enjoy God, enjoy one another, and enjoy discovering the purposes of God for us. And so we're going to get a little bit specific today. And of course, more of this will become clearer as we move forward. So I just want to pray before I share this, and why don't you join me? Heavenly Father, we thank you for what you're doing around the world. And we ask today, God, that you would give us minds and ears and eyes that would be used to understand and perceive your plans and purposes, not just for what you're doing around the world, but what you have for C3 people in the midst of all this. God, I pray that you would help us embrace the new thing that you're doing, and that you would just give us a sense of peace and assurance that you are surely with us and that we are following you into the future. And so, God, I pray that you would help us reconcile everything that we've experienced in our church life up until this point, and that you would really spark something exciting on the inside of us as we walk into the future. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. So recently we have, of course, as Jamie and I have come into the leadership of this church, we've talked about C3 Nairobi. And we've also mentioned a vision that we have in our hearts of one church in 3 locations. And so obviously some people have sort of said, well, we've heard about Nairobi, but 3 is Nairobi and Newcastle is 2. What's the third one? And so we want to let you know about that. And as I said last week, we've sort of been a little bit hesitant to talk about the third location because it's in the future and not here yet. But we've felt the need to talk about Nairobi because it's an existing reality as part of who Garth and Jamie are right now, and now who part of C3 People are right now. And so we want to unpack a little bit about how God worked in our lives to deposit this vision in our hearts of one church in 3 locations. And I think it's important to start with the Nairobi stories. So we've unpacked previously about some of the journey of Garth and Jamie moving to Nairobi to start C3 Church Nairobi, which has been such a wonderful venture to be a part of. But it's important that you know that we left Australia to move to Nairobi thinking that we would spend the rest of our lives building one church in Nairobi. So when we sold all our items in Australia at a garage sale, Jamie, who would love to be here sharing this story as well today, but our season of life hasn't allowed for that this week. But when she was at the garage sale, she would try and hide a few little pieces of our items in her room with the thought, when we come back, we'll have this nice little thing to help set up our house again. But the Lord just spoke to her and said, Jamie, I told you to sell everything. And so we did that. And honestly, it was like our grace for the nation of Australia totally lifted to the point that even when we came back the first few times after moving to Nairobi to visit family, we were like, we could never live here. This is just not what God has for us. And so when we moved to Nairobi, I think we shared previously that when we landed in East Africa together as a couple, we looked at each other and said, this feels like home. And that is a sense that I don't think we should ever underestimate with the Lord, that often when he is calling you to have grace in a particular area, that's the sort of feeling that it has, that this feels like home. And so we made home in Nairobi, and we spent the first 2 years with no thought in our hearts other than we're going to be here forever, and this is exciting. But about 2 years into the journey, God did a number on us and seemed to open our eyes to something wider than we had currently imagined. I'm not going to say bigger, because what a high calling to spend your whole life building a church. We would have done that gladly. We were excited about that. So I say wider in the sense that we felt God opening our eyes and expanding the influence that he had called us to have across different parts of the world. And this started with a thought when we were in the United Arab Emirates. So we would stop in to Dubai and Abu Dhabi, visiting friends that we met and friendships that we developed back and forward when we were coming back and forward from Australia on different trips, so that we would often spend time in the UAE. And we were really confused after a couple of years because, as I mentioned, we thought we're in Nairobi now forever. But we felt the same way in Kenya as we did in the UAE. We were in the UAE and we just had a great sense of destiny and the sense that it felt like home as well. But we sort of ignored that and thinking that, well, there's no possible way that we would ever do ministry in this part of the world. It must just be, a second, stopping place in between locations and somewhere that we might do ministry. But we never entertained the thought of doing ministry there on a long-term basis. But we were introduced through a mutual friend who have now become really good friends of ours, and that is a church in Dubai called the Gatekeepers. And the pastor there, we met for the first time, and that discussion turned to be a pivotal meeting in regards to the future of Garth and Jamie. And it went something along the lines of this. After talking for a while in this first meeting that we had, he said, look guys, I don't know what your heart is for the UAE, and I know you've just planted in Nairobi, but when I was on the way here, I felt the Lord strongly say that there is, that he had a ministry for you to build here in the UAE. And we were quite shocked because it took us by surprise, but yet it made sense and resonated within us. And he was probably the first one to stir our thinking about the possibilities of what it looks like to have a global church. And he said, hey, there's a few people starting to rise up around the world who have church in different locations. And he said, I wouldn't want you to think because you've planted in Kenya that there wouldn't be the availability to do something as well in different parts of the world. And so that was like a really thought-provoking conversation for Jamie and I. And we walked away from there trying to ignore that, trying not to think about it, but feeling like a seed had been planted within us for one church in two locations, that we would be able to do something in the UAE and Nairobi, with the UAE way to Africa and East Africa, Nairobi particularly being the gateway to the rest of the continent. And so we started to dream and to get excited and to think about what that could look like. But then there was a further spanner in the works when Jamie and I went back to Australia on a short trip in a few months after that. It was so strange that we felt like when we went to Australia in that time, that Australia felt like home. And we just looked at each other and we're saying, what is going on here? This is a third part of the world in which we feel like God has given us influence and made it feel like home. And, I remember, praying and feeling a burden for Australians again. And Jamie was in a particular church service during that trip and she started crying and going into intercession for Australia. And so we were just getting rattled and were perplexed and confused, going, what are you doing, Lord? And we felt like perhaps this crazy dream of having one church in 3 locations around the world could be a God thing. But we have learned well and truly enough that we are not into good ideas, we want God ideas. And so we took that to the Lord over the coming months into prayer, into fasting, into dreaming. And we went to a particular prophetic conference back in Dubai a few months even after that. And we said to God, we need clarity. We need to either forget about these things you've placed in or that we feel are in our hearts, or you need to spark them and confirm them and give us clarity around that. And so, again, the passion for this, the vision for this increased, and Jamie was in a particular meeting in that prophetic conference and felt the Lord show her a picture of a triangle. And that triangle represented Australia, the UAE, and Kenya. And she felt that was a moment very clearly where the Lord affirmed that. And I really resonated with that and had similar confirmations within myself over that period of time. And so in that moment, although the Lord then put it in our hearts and then said, now forget about it and build Nairobi as if you're building it forever, we spent the next 2 years from there really doing what it said that Mary did when she was told about the birth of Jesus coming up in her life. It says in Luke 2 that Mary kept these things in her heart but thought about them often. And that probably summed up our world from 2017 to 2019, going, there's this thing within us, but we need to focus on raising leaders, building the church in Nairobi. And it was a really transformational 2 years for us. So that's the background to which we come to you and we talk about Nairobi, and which led to the space of us actually taking on C3 People, that we feel like now that was the next step in bringing forth this one church in 3 locations. And we feel like those 3 nations are not just good ideas. There's a lot of countries that we like around the world. We love visiting and holidaying in different parts of the world, but these are 3 countries where we feel God has mandated us and graced us to have influence. And so only, I guess, in the past sort of year have we joined the dots with what God is actually doing around the world, like we spoke about last week, and the thing that he has been birthing within us about C3 Nairobi and now C3 People. And so it's been a really exciting season for us to understand the big picture and then also recognize that God is calling us to play a part in that, which is really, really exciting. And so C3 Nairobi exists. C3 People in Newcastle exists. The one in the UAE does not exist, but we do feel, and I've got to be honest with you, this is the thing that we haven't wanted to be too carried away with because the details are not yet there, but we do believe that God will have us start a 3rd location as a church family in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. We don't know what that's going to look like. And so you might have a lot of questions around that and go, but what, but we don't actually know exactly what that's going to look like. But there are a few things that I want to talk about here to finish. Three, I guess, main responses that I would believe would start to stir up in our hearts around this season as a church. And this will help give a little bit of clarity around how do we manage this vision? How do we manage the big picture? And how do we balance that with what God has called us to do as a church in this season? Here's three thoughts that I think will help us on that. I'm really praying, first of all, that within us would rise a wonderful sense of safety. Now, although we have been, as I mentioned, the reason that we've been hesitant to talk about what's to come in the future is not that we don't want people to know, is that we've learned first, also through people in the Bible like Joseph, that it's very dangerous to talk about dreams before it's time for them to come to pass. And so, yes, Jamie and I are pioneers and builders, and we have this thing in our hearts. But one thing you've got to know about Garth and Jamie is that we are very surrendered and very settled and patient when it comes to following the call of God. So when Nairobi first came into our hearts, I mean, for me, moving to Africa probably stirred in my heart in 2010. It was 5 years later that we moved to Nairobi. When Jamie and I felt together as a couple, the specific space that it would look like for us to minister in Africa, it took us another over 2.5 years, almost 3 years, for us to just do the journey with God in that. As I mentioned, it was well over 3 years ago now that God placed this vision in our hearts, and it took us that long of patiently persevering and walking with the Lord to see what it was like before we stepped in to the leadership of C3 People. And so while there is a bigger thing on the inside of us, we are never going to be walking ahead of what God has for us. And the only thing that scares me more than missing out and not doing what God has called us to do is doing it faster than He would have us do. So you can be very settled and assured in the fact that Jamie and I are not going to be brash in walking into and leading our churches into a third location, but we are going to be very measured in the way that we seek the Lord and will not take steps without Him giving the green light for that. We will never do that and never expand to different locations in a way that would negatively affect a current location. So the only reason that we could actually take the step from Nairobi and move to Australia is because there is a team in Nairobi that is well and truly ready, trained, and available to keep the work moving forward on our behalf in that city. And there are leaders. We have a great location pastor called Kevin Vikilu. There is a great team around him whom the church recognizes and honors as gifted and called church leaders. And so if that wasn't the case, we would never have moved on from Nairobi in that time frame. It was only because that location could handle it that we felt the time and we felt the grace for us to move on. Also need to know that we are 100% committed to C3 People, and to the point that we're looking at wanting to buy a home in Newcastle, and we are Australians at the end of the day, despite what's in our hearts around the world. If that wasn't the case, if we could not commit and carry the weight of C3 People, we would not have said yes to taking on this role. 2 Corinthians 11:28, Paul says it this way. He was talking about all the challenges that he has, and he says, then besides all this, I have the daily burden of my concern for all of the churches. So Paul modeled here what it looks like for a church leader to be called and to carry multiple locations in their heart. And Jamie will never, and I will never just add a location because we're trying to build an empire. We're not trying to build an empire. We're trying to steward what a lot of people these days are calling our metron, which is the word that Paul uses for the measure to which God has entrusted you. We want to steward and be responsible with the metron that God has placed us to have influence in. And I think the best analogy that I can use for this is that when God placed C3 Newcastle in our heart, it didn't become a division of our heart. It became an enlargement of our heart. So it wasn't like we no longer care about Nairobi and now our focus is on Newcastle. There is a grace that helps us carry equally the burden for C3 Nairobi and C3 Newcastle. And we believe, just like I'm sure some of you, you guys breed in Newcastle like there's no tomorrow. 4 kids here, 4 kids there, wanting to see who has kid number 5 soon. I think you're probably already there. But I think those parents of multiple children will be able to testify that it's not like you have a second child and a third child and all of a sudden the first one you don't care about anymore, that there is an enlarging of our hearts to carry the birth and the fruitfulness that God has called us to carry. So this is a safe season. This isn't a season that's going to lead to a brash unfolding of some grand empire building scheme. This is going to be a patient, intentional, God-paced pursuit of fruitfulness that He has called us to have as a church. Of course, this is not just Garth and Jamie. This will ultimately become something that we carry together. So the first one is, more on that soon. The first one, I want you to feel safe in this season as we talk about this. I want you to feel safe. The second thought, though, is that there should rise within us a great flexibility. Because although this is going to be a safe journey, that doesn't mean it's going to be a comfortable journey. It doesn't mean it's going to be an easy journey. That we are going to be walking into days that are unknown. And it's not a model like a traditional pastor where that pastor marries everyone, buries everyone, and stays in that city 52 weeks of the year for 40 years. As the pioneering building type that Jamie and I are, we are going to have to visit different church locations multiple times a year. There is going to be stretches as we step out and we plan new things. But I think that it is really exciting. We'll talk more about the excitement factor, but we're going to have to be flexible in walking into this church of the future, particularly because this is a church season where we are not revolving churches around the senior pastor. And I know Ryan and Erica talked about this a lot, but I think we need to go to a new level in this, that Jamie and I's commitment is not to be all things to all people. It's to raise up team and equip saints so that there is someone to be what is needed to every person in our church. And so it's going to take a real shift in our thinking to realize that Jamie and I may not be the ones that feed every need and meet every need within our church community, but we are committed. And look, if we were running one church location, this would be our heart. Not just because we're looking at a multi-site model, but our heart has been from when we started ministry, the Ephesians 4 church, that our role is to equip people for works of service and to raise leaders. Dave Gilpin says that we should not look to be hit makers, but a hit factory. So we're not the superstar that sings the hits and gets famous, but we're the producer that produces people that can do grand things for God around the world. That would sum up the heart of Garth and Jamie. So that's going to take flexibility. That's going to take walking into a whole new way of doing church life. And that is how we need to move forward. The Abu Dhabi plant. I'm thinking it's such an exciting thing. I'm getting ahead of myself to my third point, but we're going to be flexible in how we walk that out in the future. As I said, we don't know what that's going to look like exactly, but we're going to figure it out together. And so there is a sense of safety in this season, but it doesn't mean there is no stretch. And stretching and flexibility are very much linked together. And so we need to be flexible people. The third thing, which I've hinted already, is that I'm praying as we feel a sense of safety and we try and develop a flexible attitude on the inside of us, that there would be a deep excitement that develops in each one of us. And so I just think what an amazing opportunity to spend our time not in a safe model where it's a traditional method and the pastor's around every week of the year, but what a wonderful opportunity to be a part of something that is brand new and pioneering. I know I'm a pioneering type, so some of you may not share that excitement just now, but I'm praying that the gift to pioneer on our lives would bring a great sense of excitement to your life to be part of something that's new on the earth. And so not only will we have the chance to get to know the family in Nairobi over the coming years, but we're going to be able to go on a journey together, Nairobi and Newcastle, to plant a church in one of the hubs of Islam in the Middle East. And there are not enough churches in Abu Dhabi right now to even meet the needs of Christian expats who are in the city, let alone reaching out into that region. And so this is going to be an exciting thing, reaching parts of the world that not a whole lot of churches are putting their hand up to go and reach. Even as we've talked a little bit about Abu Dhabi recently, we haven't talked much about it for the reasons that I've communicated. But when we've had people from different parts of the world message us and say, I can see myself in Abu Dhabi as part of that church plant. So I'm actually going to be talking a little bit in the next maybe couple of months about how we can even start raising funds for that church plant years ahead of time. So that when the time comes to build that church, that we are going to be the head and not the tail. That we are going to not be hamstrung by a lack of resources to pull it off, but we're going to have everything that we need to do so. And the good news is that C3 Amsterdam, who supported Jamie and I for a number of years in Nairobi, they want to commit to helping support a church plant in the Middle East. And so even churches like that are saying, I don't mind if it's 3 to 5 years away. We're going to put money aside now and continue to give into that vision so that when the time comes, that church can launch with strength and wisdom. So I think this is really, really wonderful. And I'm praying that this sense of excitement would activate us into the purpose of God for our lives, even as we build the church in Newcastle and around the world, whatever that looks like into the future. But the midterm vision, one church in 3 locations, it's going to be really, really exciting. And I believe this. I had a prophetic sense as I was preparing this, that there would be, that I know that C3 People has reached out with different locations and different things to invest in over the past. And some of those have brought about great joy and fulfillment. Sometimes that stretch has caused some pain, and there's been some wins and there's been some hits and misses. But I do believe we're going to be able to learn from the past and move into a space where we do again enter into spaces of reaching beyond our location. Because if you look around at the people even in your group right now, there is way too much human resource and call and talent to just do one service in one location in one city. There is a mandate on this church, which is something that Jamie and I sensed, which was part of the decision for involved in the decision of walking into this space for Jamie and I, that is called to reach beyond our current space. And so I think that we're going to find a great balance between the stretch of faith and the boundaries of wisdom as we walk into the future to build the church around the world and play our part in the global church that God is building around the world. And so this is going to be, Jamie and I, to reiterate, are 100% committed to what God is building in Newcastle. We are excited. We can't wait to move to Newcastle. We are committed, even more so over the long term, based on this vision, to lead us into this multi-site model around the world that is going to be empowering, relational, and equipping of people in different parts of the world. And so we are absolutely committed to what God has placed for us in Newcastle. We are absolutely committed to what God is calling us to around the world. They are not at odds with each other. And so I'm praying that as we incline our hearts to one another and we walk together, that we would find great joy in serving the city of Newcastle, and that we would find great fulfillment as we reach beyond that to be a blessing to people all around the world. And so I'm praying that something is sparked. Hey, who knows what you're going to be a part of in the future? You might have thought that you're going to spend the rest of your days in Newcastle, but you'll be part of planting churches around the world. Who knows? Don't get too scared by that. But if you have any questions, please get in touch. As I say, not all of them will be able to be answered at this point because we are going to be walking into this progressively. But happy to talk about this. But I'm praying excitement is filling your heart. I'm praying you feel safe in this. And I'm praying that you would join me in being flexible people as we follow God into the future. I'm praying for you, church. I'm praying for God to touch your life. I'm praying for God to open doors of favor in this season. I'm praying for him to provide every need for you over Christmas and the new year. I'm praying that your family are going to be witnessed to and ministered to by the love of God over this season. And I'm praying that God is going to heal you, restore you, raise you up to do mighty things and to enter 2021 with excitement, with purpose, with intentionality, and with the grace of God on your life. Can't wait to see you somewhere over the next few weeks. I'm really excited for the future. God bless you, church. Take care.